Hi, thanks for coming over to our little secret tent. I wanted to start, because we're going to be talking about family, to establish what kind of family did you grow up in and what kind of family are you in now?
Hi everyone, I'm James Black, President and CEO of Family Equality. I grew up in a family, first of all, my parents were teenage parents. And so they were 18 years old when they had me. And shortly thereafter, they divorced. So I had a single parent household led by my mother, and every now and again I would see my father. And my grandmother and great-grandmothers and aunts and uncles were also an extension of that, because my mother went to school to become a nurse. So she could not take care of us full-time as she was trying to create upward mobility in her life. That shaped me a lot, right? Because having a single mother, seeing how she struggled, I wanted to ensure that when I had a family that I did not have the same obstacles. My wife and I have 9-year-old, 4th grade, twin boys. And I'm very proud of my family. And we were very intentional about creating our family, and I was intentional about wanting to ensure that I had a 2-parent household. Not that a 1-parent household is any less important than a 2-parent household, but I saw the struggles that my mother had. So my wife and I married for 18 years, and we have, I'd say, I guess, a 2-parent household.
And what kind of community do you live in?
We live in a very suburban neighborhood in Northern Virginia, and we are the only LGBTQ plus family in the neighborhood. That's not odd. We are accustomed, even when we lived in Texas, we were the only LGBTQ plus family in the neighborhood. So no one else in the neighborhood looks like us, and from what we can see, there are not any other families who are LGBTQ plus.
And how does it feel in your family, in your neighborhood?
It often feels isolating. And one of the ways that I see that is through my children. And we were at the bus stop the other day before school ended, and one of my twins' friends just said, wait, you have 2 moms? And Duke said, yeah. And he said, oh, that sucks. You don't have a dad. That must be sad. And Duke said, no, that's not sad at all. And then he proceeds to repeat the sort of script that we gave him. Some people have a mom and a dad. Some people have 2 moms. Some people have 2 dads. Some people have 1 mom. Some people were raised by their grandmothers. He sort of just repeated this entire script that we've been feeding to the boys since they could understand. But it does feel isolating, right? Because my wife and I signed up for this, if you will, in terms of wanting to live in this neighborhood and have this location that had better schools. But our boys are still trying to figure that out. I'll say they're incredibly proud of their families, but the society at large and the neighborhood are not well adjusted or culturally competent when it comes to our families. So a lot of times they get sort of left out of things. I will say one other point, it's better than Texas. And we specifically left Texas in 2022 to move to the East Coast because we did not want to raise our family in Texas, even though that's our home state.
Interesting. Raina, how about you?
So I grew up in what looked like a conventional nuclear family, mother, father, brother who's 8 years older than me, but kind of from the outside is different from the inside. My parents didn't have a great marriage. My mom actually had planned to leave in the early 2000s or late 2000s, and then the economic crash happened and she couldn't afford to leave, so my parents were living in the house together but really functionally separated. And when I went off to college, then my mom ended up moving. So my parents actually never legally divorced, so I guess on the books it looks like they are still married and that I grew up in a nuclear family household, but that kind of wasn't exactly the reality that I was living. And then at this point, I am married and I live with my husband. For 3 years, we lived also with 2 of our close friends and their 2 children. The chapter of that ended recently because our friends had jobs that they had to take in a different state, and we knew it would be temporary, but my husband and I are still really excited about continuing this sort of setup of living with friends. So we have a different friend who's living with us right now, and we're seeing this as kind of a trial run to see if we want to maybe buy a home together, potentially co-parent, and giving this a bit of a test. We've enjoyed having other close connections that we share besides our relationship.
Interesting. Okay, so this conversation is really about what is beyond the nuclear family. 18% of America is heterosexual couple married with children. 18%. So I want to talk about what's possible beyond that. And you've written this book, which I really recommend, The Other Significant Others, where you describe people like Barb and Inez. So will you take us through a little bit of that story and how that showed you what other structures could work for creating a family where there can be as much flourishing as we assume is possible in what we've been calling the nuclear family?
Mm-hmm. So I met Barb and Inez at a house that they own together, this ranch-style house in the suburbs of St. Louis. They are now in their 80s. They have been best friends for 50 years, and they bought that house together when they were on the cusp of retirement. And in fact, they had been living in Arizona and moved states together and found this place. They have supported each other through kind of everything you can imagine, including Inez had been married and ended up divorcing her husband and had 2 children. So Barb supported Inez through the divorce, had Inez and the kids live with her at one point. Barb was a huge support when Inez's son died, when he was in his 30s. They have been financially intertwined. They have taken care of each other for hospital stays, and they ended up retiring together and buying this home, not because they really had planned to, even though they had supported each other, but because they couldn't afford otherwise. They wanted to have 2 homes right near each other like they had had in Arizona for years. And in the end, the arrangement has made a lot of sense. They have bedrooms right next to each other, and one has a bell that she'll ring if anything happens in the middle of the night, because there was a period where Inez had an emergency and Barb couldn't hear her. So that's the level of devotion that they have to one another. And they had each kind of tried a more conventional path. Barb really wanted to have children of her own, especially because she's adopted and had never seen anybody who looked like her, but had emergency surgery when she was in her 20s that left her infertile. So, and in Inez's case, she had been married, had a husband who was not a good father and not a faithful husband. So they had kind of wanted something that was more conventional, and then in the end have found the kind of support and sustenance that people expect in a marriage, in the friendship instead.
And one of the things that came up in the book was Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal, and the ways that people age and die, and pushing that up against another book called How to Not Die Alone, which is a dating book, a provocatively named dating book. And the idea that you put forth is that it's no guarantee that if you are married, any kind of marriage, you will end up being taken care of. And it's no guarantee that if you have children, they will come up underneath you and save you as you age and need support.
Yeah. I mean, I will say as a disclaimer, my friend wrote that book, How Not to Die Alone, and I actually think the content is really interesting and smart. I think the title is a little provocative, and it does speak to the way that people think that marriage is going to be this ticket for connection and a salve against loneliness for the rest of your life. I mean, when same-sex marriage became the law of the land, Justice Kennedy had this soaring language that was quite beautiful, but had said that marriage was essentially what stood between you and loneliness, and that if you cried out in the middle of the night, that there would be somebody there. And not all marriages last, either because people survive their spouses. I mean, one stat that I find kind of astonishing is that 30% of women over 65 in the U.S. are widowed, and 49% are single. So, what do we do about that stage of life? And 40% of marriages are projected to end in divorce. So, there are so many ways that toward the end of life, we might not have somebody who is a romantic partner by our sides, even though we're told that that is the one way that you can ensure that kind of care.
Well, it also brings into question how important romance is in the paternal relationship such that kids can flourish. Do you have a theory or a thought about that?
I'm going to get a little vulnerable here. I do. There's a book called The New I Do, and I don't know if anyone's read it, that my wife and I picked up about 5 or so years ago. And it was at a time in our marriage when we were having some stumbling blocks, and that happens. And one of the concepts or marriage structures that we found interesting that could be something that we could live with is this notion of a parenting marriage. And if it ever happened that we would not be together and we had kids, what would it look like to continue to have our family stay together and thrive? And I don't think that romance is necessary. I really think it is about love and having a loving and flourishing and stable home. But is romantic love necessary? I don't think so. And I think the demonstration of a parenting marriage is one of those models. Now, have I seen where those have been successful? I've read where sometimes they're successful and sometimes, kind of to your parents' point, where it just gets too stressful and people just want to, they want to leave and move. But oftentimes that can happen, whether it's purposefully or not. So I don't think that romance is necessary for children to flourish.
So if we're talking specifically about creating environments in which children can flourish, not necessarily the parents, just the children for a moment, what parts of the argument for a traditional nuclear family do you understand? Do you feel are supported by data? And which parts do you think are generally misunderstood or that you could not ever get behind?
This one's hard for me because my work is to ensure that people who are not traditional can create families. I will say there's an argument to be made that the social stigma that occurs when you're not a traditional family and that a traditional family does not have to deal with is beneficial. When I think about the bullying that my children have to endure, why we moved from Texas was largely driven by the experience that my kids were having in Texas schools because they were being raised by two mothers, being raised by two black mothers. It's a whole other type of layer of discrimination. And if you were a traditional, compare that to my sister's family, who also black family in Texas, they're a traditional family, if you want to use that term, they don't have the social stigma. And so I think there's an argument to be made that it makes it easier. I understand why people see that. I experienced that. I wish my kids did not have to endure the social stigma that our family does have to endure sometimes. I would also say that there could be economic benefits, and I don't have the data behind it in terms of if there's been a study behind sort of the comparison, but what we do know is that LGBTQ plus people have a higher poverty rate than our straight counterparts. So if you put that into sort of economic terms, trying to raise and thrive within the family, that could be a disadvantage. Mm-hmm. So I could see those arguments when people think or want to kind of compare the traditional structure to a structure that is non-traditional, that is stigmatized by society, and where even your economic ability and opportunities are decreased because of your family.
Right, but then you could say that any group who has a hard time making money in this society should not have children. You could say that disadvantage is so strong that maybe we shouldn't let people who only make $30,000 a year have children.
You could say that, and I think there's an economic struggle which is different than horrible bullying and discrimination.
Yes, although
but very different. It's like, oh, we can't buy extra groceries because I grew up like that. Versus now we have to move because we don't feel safe in our neighborhoods.
Yes.
And my kids are not flourishing. Those are two very different things.
Is there anything about the argument that you understand or makes sense to you before we break it down?
Yeah, I mean, I am in the middle of a book that came out actually the same day as mine with a different thesis. It's called Get Married. So, it's a pro-marriage book. And one of the things I was struck by was that I think some of the underlying concerns are the same ones that I have about that people are lonely in this country. There are high rates of loneliness. People need connection, and that there's sort of ways that individualism can keep people from binding themselves to others, and that there's a lot of satisfaction that can come from sharing your life with another person. Those are things that I am on board with, and I think some of the kind of issues that I see with the data are, one, selection, essentially. Like, so if you're looking at who is happier or who is wealthier, and people like this author, Brad Wilcox and others, will say that married people are happier than unmarried people, or they make more money over the life course than unmarried people. And it's like, well, who is getting married in the first place. And there's a big, gradient in terms of people who are more highly educated, who have more money, are entering marriage in the first place. So the kind of cause and effect I'm less persuaded by, and particularly on the happiness front, that it's hard to disentangle people being happier when they are married, if you're looking in the statistics, from a culture that tells them the way to be happy is to be married, and you're going to be treated as a full member of society essentially only if you're married. I've had people tell me that they feel, who are single, that they're treated as an extra, that they're not invited to events because they're not coupled, that society's built for couples. And one version of this that I got was, I wrote a piece in The Atlantic about very committed, intimate friendships. And afterward, a woman wrote to me saying that she's divorced and she had been dating because she felt like the thing she needed to do was fill this hole in her life and find a spouse. But she had this very kind of friendship that I'd written about in the article, and she said that the article was a welcome slap in the face for her, because it helped her realize that there was no hole in her life, that she had been content, and she had been unable to see it because the world around her had told her that there is something missing and that you cannot be happy. So I find it, at least, if not unconvincing, then at least difficult to be sure that when these statistics are put in front of us, that we can say that there's cause and effect, that marriage is creating these better outcomes, rather than they're all kind of part of this dance that are related, and that if we change the culture, that might give people more opportunities for flourishing that can coexist with, be outside of marriage.
I feel like one of the ways I've grown the most in the last couple of years as a thinker is to appreciate that not all data is that great, and that you just can't rely on it. You can't sort of put your head on the pillow at night and say, well, the data says, because data is so often flawed and misused and misinterpreted.
I mean, I don't want to totally discount all data. I've covered the social sciences for a lot of years. I would be a little bit hypocritical to be like, well, this data is, useless because it's not a randomized controlled trial, because we can't, randomly assign people to be married or not, and then use it in other areas of life. But I think the thing to ask here is, okay, let's say all of this is true, and I think there are problems with the data. What do we actually do about it? I mean, we have a society that already encourages marriage, that already rewards having a nuclear family, that stigmatizes other kinds of families. There are some things in the legal code that we can do to maybe not disincentivize marriage in some ways, but it's also incredibly incentivized. I mean, I know so many people who got married for different kinds of legal rights, for healthcare, because one partner was on one continent, one was on the other, and that was the way to get a green card. They loved each other, but if marriage in particular mattered for that purpose. So it's not so clear what you do with that data in terms of people's actual lives, because Richard Reeves, who's a bit more moderate on this, has talked about how the genie is just not going back in the bottle, and the way that people are living their lives have changed. And instead of trying to reverse course, we can think about, how do we give people the goods that we think are in a marriage, like commitment, like caregiving.
So one of Family Equality's mission statements includes making parenthood easier for more people to achieve and experience. Why and how?
So the work of Family Equality is to remove barriers to parenthood for LGBTQ plus people. And I think just telling a bit about our origin story, the way that we got started is in the 70s, when these gay dads who were leaving their straight marriages and they had children, they were being prevented access and parenting rights to their children. And they started an organization called the Gay Fathers Coalition, now known as Family Equality, and this was really a custody battle, right? Because now that they had come out as gay, and as you can imagine, being gay in the 70s was not easy. Being a gay parent was even harder. But now that it come out, what society thought is that, well, you don't deserve to be a parent. So when I think about explaining our work, I want folks to understand that our families and people who are LGBTQ+ have the right and deserve and want to be parents just as well. And that's really important. And when people say why, I mean, I think we all have to be on equal footing. Like, it's a constitutional right, that we are all sort of protected, equally protected, right? And that also means to create families in the way that we decide to. You can't prevent someone from becoming a parent simply because of who they love. And that's why our work is really important. Another part of our work is there's a lesbian couple in Michigan some years back who wanted to foster a child in foster care. And the caseworker said, no, because you are lesbian. And wouldn't you know it, 5 years later, this little boy was still in foster care. So not only is it about when we want to create families in the way that we want to and we choose, whether it's surrogacy, IVF, adoption, but oftentimes it's saving a child's life. It's plucking this child out of foster care, the child welfare system, which is about 400,000 children go through that system every year, and putting them into a loving home. Because when they are not, and they have to age out of foster care, they have a whole different set of circumstances that we don't need to get into, but they're not good. So really, it's really about ensuring that we are removing barriers, that we are reducing the number of children who are in foster care, that we are not shrinking the pool of parents, but we are expanding the pool of parents who want to be parents to foster children, especially LGBTQ plus children who are often kicked out of their homes and would be better suited to have a life with two dads or two moms or one lesbian mom or whatever it may be. So our work is really important in terms of ensuring that every person, because we can't have, you and I were talking about belonging and acceptance, until we remove the barriers for every person, then we can't have a country that is grounded in belonging and acceptance.
I don't think there's one answer to this question, but what do you think some of the reasons are that people do not want non-hetero married couples to have children? What's at the heart of it? And I know you're just sharing opinions here. I know that there's not.
Well, I'll take this from a personal level.
Sure.
From a personal perspective, and I'll use my family's reasoning, it was religion. And we take this, the scripture and loosely interpret it to mean that not only can you be LGBTQ+, but that also means that you cannot be a parent. You also shouldn't have a family. And that was the excuse that my wife's parents said to us. They've since turned it around. People also believe that you need a man in the family. I've heard people say that too. You're missing something if you don't have a male presence in your life. And I think on the contrary, people believe that if there are two men, they're missing something if there's not a woman in the household. So I think there's these traditional structures that have been long believed and also promoted, whether it be in media, books, etc., that people have believed are the right thing, are the most effective, without understanding what the sort of the full spectrum of families should look like. But I do think that religion has something to do with it, and I do think just the holding on to traditional structures and letting that go is really hard for people.
Do you have theories about why people don't want friends to get together, why they don't want a child to have 3 legal parents, why they don't want 2 couples to live together or buy a home together?
So I think this answer is also connected to your question about, what do I take on from what conservatives might think and buy into? And I think there is a legitimate concern about stability, that kids do better when there is stability. There's research to back this up. But I think there's a conflation of stability with a certain kind of family structure, and one that is maybe more familiar to people, and also that is described as traditional, and the term traditional is kind of a proxy for saying it is innate or it is right or it is better. So I think the unfamiliarity of having 2 mothers or having a multi-parent family household, as an example, I write in the book about 2 friends who are raising a child together. One had actually intended to have the child on her own. The friend fell in love with the kid, wanted to raise him as well, and he has special needs. And then that woman got into a romantic relationship, and so the 3 of them all take care of the kid together. I think it helps for people to see stories like that, because I don't know what people were thinking in this room when they heard 3-parent family. Maybe they're like, they thought something that seemed unfamiliar or radical, but it actually can really disarm you or surprise you to look at what does it actually entail to have that kind of setup. So I think it's unfamiliarity, and then using the familiar as the benchmark against which everything else is deemed either worthy or not worthy. And there's research to show that really family structure is not particularly important to the outcomes of children, like their psychological well-being, and that it is instead about stability, it's about warmth and support that kids get. But that's not necessarily something that everybody knows.
Yeah. It's interesting how often we as people want to define something once and for all and have it be the default. And your friend coined a new term that I thought resonated.
Yeah, this is the friend who's currently, who I'm currently living with.
You're the one you're trying out?
Or he's trying out us. It's a mutual. So I mean, basically the context for this is that he was about to leave DC, where we were all living, to be in a relationship with a woman, or to live with her. And he had experience with polyamory, and he was saying, I don't think like everybody should be poly. I'm also, I'm not against monogamy. I don't think everybody should be monogamous. And he's like, what I'm against is like adherence to defaults. And then he was like, default to me. And he kind of used it as a jokey term. But it took me a moment to be like, oh, that is what this is all about to me. It's that we have been given a default, and we've been sort of on this march, like the woman who emailed me and said that essentially the default for her was, after being divorced, to get remarried because that would make her whole, and that we don't often have opportunities to question, does the default actually fit us? Like, is that the right thing for our lives or for a chapter of our lives? Because marriage might be there for 40 years, but at some point it's not there anymore. And then what do you do there? So I think that it is in some ways destabilizing for people to detach from those defaults, because if they have been told that that is your ticket to happiness, and suddenly there are more options in front of you, then you have to actually figure out for yourself what you want, and that's actually quite hard.
It's creating decision fatigue.
Yeah, I mean, one person I interviewed in the book is a straight man who grew up in a conservative environment. His name is Nick. He's a youth pastor. And he became very close with a friend of his who is gay and also trained to be a youth pastor. And Nick kind of put a lot of things off the table. Like he didn't want to be touched by any other man. He felt like that was uncomfortable. Like even in a friendship context, emotional intimacy was very unfamiliar to him in friendship. And as his gay friend helped him rethink some of the things that he had taken for granted as like what made him feel comfortable or uncomfortable, Nick then had to ask himself questions to figure out, what is it that I actually want? And these two friends broke this down to ask themselves, what is moral, like as in what does the Bible say about some behavior, what is cultural, and what is personal. And so he started to ask himself that, and realized, as an example, that he actually doesn't dislike it when his friend puts his arm on his shoulder. He just has like a little bit of sensory overload when his friend is like rubbing, moving his hand. And that just, if you think about how much thought that takes to go through that process, as opposed to just to have like input and output. Culture tells me this, or my parents told me this, or I've been doing this, been programmed this way for 20-something years, and he has found it hard, but ultimately really rewarding. But it's made me, like, looking at him, appreciate that defaults are efficient, or they can be efficient if it's the right thing, and they can send you terribly off course and mean, like in his case, that he would have never had this extraordinarily deep connection to a friend who he considers a brother to him now, if he had not been able to disconnect from the things that he had been raised with, including a father who won't sit right next to him on the couch, and who he doesn't remember the last time his father had hugged him. So, there's a real way that he had to unlearn and then interrogate what he actually wanted.
Yeah, and that's a part of adulthood. I mean, that's a part of coming of age, is deciding what the defaults were when you were raised and which you're going to carry into your adult life. I wonder I think one of the easiest things to understand about why people need the legal right to get married is the medical scenarios where someone can't get into the hospital, they can't talk to a doctor, they can't help make decisions about care and treatment. I wondered if you believe that being financially or legally entangled increases commitment. Or if we know that, if we happen to know the numbers on that.
have an opinion. I don't have the numbers, but I have an opinion. And I think that it increases commitment, good and bad. And what I mean by that is that it increases commitment because now we're entangled and we have joint bank accounts and we've created a home together and we have a mortgage together, and that feels solid and it feels real. And then if the marriage is, or the relationship is ending, sometimes people stay because those financial entanglements are too hard to untangle. And I've seen that with many of my friends. Well, it's really hard to untangle all of these things, and so we're gonna try. And so I think that financial entanglement can be good and bad, but I do think it can increase commitment. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I also think it would be hard to know exactly the answers here, but a couple of things come to mind. One, as someone who's looked on the friendship side of this, I mean, that is a relationship without legal rights, where people will think that it shouldn't involve any work and it shouldn't involve any kind of ties to each other. And there are pluses and minuses to that. I mean, it can create immense freedom, but it also means that people will walk away when things get difficult at all. And I think that's kind of one of the remarkable things about many of the people I met who have these friendships that rise to the level of partnership, that they want to bind themselves to each other. Many of them have gotten legal rights in the ways that they can, like Barb and Inez, who we talked about at the beginning. They have medical and legal power of attorney rights to one another. Other people have written each other into their wills. So if people want to be bound to each other, I think we should give them the opportunity, and there might be some high risk, high reward there, but not having people have the opportunity to, whether through marriage or some other means, get those sorts of rights can make it easier for people to not take a relationship seriously.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about legislation, something that would be hugely powerful and productive, something that would be totally destructive in, say, the next 2 presidential administrations. Can you name anything?
Yeah, 2 examples. The first that I think would be really progressive and really impactful is to pass a piece of legislation called the John Lewis Every Child Deserves a Family Act. And this is a piece of legislation that would end federally funded foster care agencies from discriminating against LGBTQ plus people, religious minorities, single people. There are still 14 states, Idaho just became the 14th state, that can discriminate against an LGBTQ plus person who wants to foster and adopt if they believe that person's does not align with the agency's religious beliefs. Passing a piece of legislation like that would not only decrease or end that discrimination, it also transforms the foster care system for the youth in the system.
Can I interrupt and say, do you have any hope that will pass?
I have not with this Congress, but we are going to introduce it again in the Senate, because introducing it keeps it in the ether, keeps it in sort of like everyone's minds and hearts, so they know how it's important. And what's good, it's a bipartisan piece of legislation. I think that's important. And that's one of the sort of the values of family equality. As divisive as things can be, we really try to ensure that we are working across the aisles. So, so we have some hope, hopefully, maybe the next Congress. What would be completely destructive is Project 2025, and if you've not heard of it, please look it up. The Heritage Foundation, this is essentially Trump's transition team or transition plan. And it's a 900-page document that's really scary. It's not a threat, it is a promise. And what would be completely destructive to what we're talking about now is that they're promoting this sort of heteroconformity in terms of traditional family structures. And one of the statements in this document is something along the lines of traditional family structures with one man, one woman, and a child are something along the lines of the core to a well-ordered society. That's scary. I think it threatens my work. I think it threatens the work that you talk about, and we should take it seriously. And if things don't go the way that we want them to go to in November, then we could be dealing with that.
And that, I think, inherently points back to what turns out to be sort of an anomalous moment in human history, which is the 50s, the Leave It to Beaver family. But before that, when you look across time and culture, you don't see the Leave It to Beaver family.
Absolutely not. And I'll say, I mentioned this to you earlier. If you even go back to pre-colonial Africa, before the Portuguese arrived and colonized the Africans, there were all sorts of family structures that actually align with what we're talking about today. And there were queer people and gender non-binary people. And this whole focus of colonization and ensuring that they structured society to match this sort of Christian view of things, that's where it sort of started. And you can trace that from pre-colonial Africa to Jamestown, to Reconstruction, to the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, you can trace all of that in terms of how families were sort of very expansive, and then it starts to sort of be very boxed in. Mm-hmm. But that's really, historically, that's not how families have been.
I was in Tanzania in February with the Maasai, and my first reaction to the story of these family structures where there's 6 wives and 1 husband and 30 kids was like, God bless those poor women. And then it just took about an hour for me to be like, it wouldn't be so bad.
Well, it's interesting that you give Tanzania as an example, because I interviewed a woman who's now about 30, and she grew up in a household where it was her 2 parents and then her mom's best friend, Sue. And someone's like, that's awesome, yeah. And it's very complicated in the U.S. They were in a farm in Wisconsin to explain to other people who Sue was. Then the parents, without Sue yet, went, and the kids went to Tanzania, and Sue eventually came, and they were describing who Sue was, and went through the whole rigmarole. And then the people that they were talking to in Tanzania had a term for a person like her, which I might be mispronouncing this, but it was Mama Kidogo. It was in Swahili, and it basically meant little mom. And that was so validating to Sue and to the rest of the family to be like, there is a term for a person who plays this role in our lives. So the idea that, the nuclear family has always been around is obviously not true, but also that it is worth looking to the past and to other places where parents have gotten more support. And to the question at the beginning about, what is the family environment that I grew up in and what did I create, I see a parallel with what my brother ended up creating, but his maybe looks a little bit more traditional, that he has a multi-generational family. So my sister-in-law is from China. She grew up with her grandmother in the house. Her parents recently moved to the U.S. to take care of the infant that my brother and sister-in-law now have, and my dad lives with them. And they were joking that as a newborn, that this one newborn was running 4 adults ragged. So that I think that we can actually learn from these other kinds of family setups, as opposed to saying that we have arrived at the best possible version, when in fact so many people feel overwhelmed and could have, not just 2 parents, but maybe 3 parents or friends, or have grandparents or other people around, and that it kind of narrows the vision too much to be like, this creates a well-ordered society to have these, 2 adults, 1 child setup.
Especially when that setup often breaks, that 50% of the time. Tell me what legislation you'd love to see passed and what scares the hell out of you.
Well, I'm a journalist, and I'm not supposed to have opinions as a staff member at NPR. I'm not supposed to have opinions on politics, but I will say things that I'm watching. So there's a great organization called the Chosen Family Law Center that does work that's kind of parallel to what Family Equality does, providing both legal services to non-nuclear families. So this can be LGBTQ families, can be poly families, families where they're platonic co-parents, and so on. So they do legal services, but also legal advocacy, and they have gotten several ordinances passed in California and Massachusetts that allow people to have domestic partnerships with one another, which have kind of like gone away after the Supreme Court case that made same-sex marriage legal. And that provides more options for people who don't have a romantic relationship but want to codify that. It also does not set limits on the number of partners. So you can have 3 people and they can bind each other to one another. And they've also, this group has helped pass the first non-discrimination law. So you can't discriminate on the basis of family structure, according to this law in Somerville, Massachusetts. So I'm really interested to see if those spread beyond those small localities, if there's buildup, and also if there ends up being a kind of like template that you can have some kind of legal alternative to marriage for people for whom marriage is not the right fit, or they want to distribute rights among more than one person and get kind of core financial and healthcare rights that so many people want. Anything that scares you? I mean, you informed me earlier about the kind of proposal that's on the books. I think anything that is trying to put people down one path and says, if you don't do that, then it's bad, where there is a hierarchy that does not actually respond to the reality of our lives, that life just takes you by surprise, and that you might not end up with the kind of family structure that you had wanted, or that everyone's telling you that you should want. I want to have a society where people can imagine larger possibilities for their lives, and if legislation gets in the way, that's scary. So what you're trying to solve for is for people to bind together in whatever way they can. Would you say that's accurate? That what you're seeing is this loneliness epidemic, and then you're seeing this very narrow definition of what it is to be not lonely, and then you're seeing all these people who don't have access, for whatever reason, to the tiny little circle that's been defined for us. And so what is there for them to come and go on this earth and feel a part of something, to belong to someone? It's very all or nothing. And I think that is a sort of terrible thing to tell people, that there is only one way to have meaning in your life and to not experience loneliness. And exactly what the mantra of love is love, that in the queer community, I think applies to multiple kinds of love, not just romantic love, but it can be platonic love, it can be familial love. Like, one thing I encountered a lot while I was working on the book was people would tell me, like, can it be two siblings? Like, I know, I have these aunts who have been living together next door to each other for 30 years. Like, I think we should be embracing any form of care and commitment and connection, because that's what we have a deficit of, rather than saying that if you don't get this one type, then throw it all out, or don't even look for it in the first place, and we are going to, denigrate it. Because that's what I've seen, that people who have these sorts of friendships are questioned by the people around them. They are gossiped about. They're assumed to be closeted, that they're either lying to others or themselves, rather than saying, wow, you decided to move across the country for one another, or you have, embarked on the project of parenting together, or you have taken care of the other's family. Like, I think that we should embrace that. Yeah, interdependence is beautiful. It's a fact, and it's beautiful. We have 9 minutes to take your questions. Who's got one? I know Dan Savage will have a question. So if all else fails, we're just going to bring him up and let him riff. Yes?
I have a comment. I grew up as an only child. And, when you do that, when I was growing up, people wouldn't say, do you have any brothers and sisters? They'd say, how many brothers and sisters? And I'd say none. And they'd look at you like you had, So, but what I've learned to do, and what I've done my whole life, is find my tribe. Tribalism has taken on a bad name, but definitely have a coterie of friends who become familial for me. I have a daughter now and 2 grandchildren, a great son-in-law, and a nice boyfriend too. But I think that I realized as a kid, I felt other, and so. And I wanted to ask you, where did you move, and how are your kids doing?
Thank you. We moved to Northern Virginia, and initially DC, and it made sense because of the work that I do largely happens out of DC. And then we weren't too thrilled with some of the schools, so we moved to Northern Virginia, just probably 20 minutes down the road. My kids, even though they still get questions, they are doing great. They are flourishing. They feel the need to advocate for their family a lot of times, and they also feel a difference, a marked difference. We had this really painful experience with a teacher one time who was treating one of my twins really bad, and we couldn't figure out why. And making a long story short, after several meetings with the school, they think they were maybe in kindergarten at this time, we this brave teacher pulled us aside and said, hey, you know that teacher in London's class, she confided in us in the teacher's conference room or lunchroom that she's treating him like that because he has 2 moms and she believes in the Bible and that's wrong. And when you think about those things, like a lot of times your kids don't know why they're being treated like that, but they know they're being treated differently. So it is a world of difference, and I'm so happy that we decided to move.
And their names are London and Duke.
London
That's
and
pretty
Duke.
rad. Well done.
Can I just say something in response to this comment that I thought I was like writing about friendship, and what I ended up realizing was that people like in your situation who somehow feel like they are on the outside are the people who seem to have the most imaginative capacity to find family and find connection in ways that had not been laid out before them. So, this including people who are asexual, people who decided to couldn't find a partner and wanted to have a child on their own, people who are part of the larger queer umbrella, that they're, instead of kind of treating people who are on the outside as if like there's something to pity, that so much of the time that they're doing something that nobody else is seeing as possible because they at least can attempt to do the right thing, and aren't necessarily forced to be more creative.
Mm-hmm.
I do have a question. One of the critiques of the marriage equality movement was that we were out there arguing that there were rights, benefits, and responsibilities that came bundled with marriage that we were denied access to around health insurance, immigration, green cards, alimony in the case of a breakup. And one of the critiques was we should be arguing to disentangle all of these rights from marriage, to unbundle them from marriage. And I'm curious what you think that would do to marriage if fewer people were sort of maybe in the back of their minds being economically coerced into marriage. And there's certainly circumstances like you addressed where people stay in marriages that they might want to leave because of the economic consequences of divorce. But health insurance and all these other things that we just associate with marriage in America are not bundled with marriage in most of the European Union and a lot of other countries because healthcare is a right. And would it threaten marriage? Would fewer people be married if we had argued instead of let us in, release these things?
It's an interesting question, Dan. If you would have asked me this, 2015 when Obergefell was decided, I would have said you should not decouple. You shouldn't even think about that. And I was mentioning to Kelly earlier that my wife and I married in Canada before Obergefell was the law of the land because it was about, y'all too, right? Because it was about, marriage was validation, and it really didn't matter, sort of kind of thinking about what made sense in terms of decoupling benefits, et cetera. It was the marriage, it was the universal connection that everyone is supposed to sort of want, right? I think you have a point, and today I would say that there's an opportunity to rethink it because we do know that queer Gen Zers are waiting for marriage or don't want to get married at all. And how do we create a sort of a safe, stable world for them where they don't have to be financially coerced into marriage, where they have the options, benefits, et cetera, without the marriage ties. So I don't know if it would threaten marriage. I think that we would be designing for the generation, which is our Gen Zers who want to get married now, who would be getting married now, who are really not interested in marriage like my Gen X self was. So I think it would be an evolution of Obergefell versus Hodges, actually.
I mean, I guess two things come to mind. One is, why do we want people to get married in the first place? So, like, do we want people to affirmatively get married, or do we want them to be strong-armed because of healthcare rights? And would it be a bad thing if fewer people got married, but those who got married actively wanted to? I think there's a good argument for that. And the other thought was there, and maybe it is now disappearing. So
you're young for that, my friend.
Well, but can
I make you know me? That's
I know the thought.
Okay, go ahead. Then I'm gonna pick a point after you.
Okay. The other thing is, so what does it look like to unbundle? One option is to strip marriage down and to bring it basically to the bones that make sense. Where I think the state has a real incentive to try to stabilize relationships. So anything that might encourage interdependency economically and and caregiving, like those sorts of rights make sense, and then you can get rid of like the zillion other things that are attached to marriage. But but is it still marriage or nothing, the way it is in 40 U.S. states right now, or is it marriage and some alternative that people could have, and if they didn't want to have the connotations of marriage but wanted some kinds of rights? And in places where that has happened, like in California, where everyone can get a civil union at this point, or in France where there's a legal alternative to marriage, there are a lot of people who end up opting for that. And how important is it that people get married versus get more sort of solid support for the relationship? And I'm more interested in what the actual function is, and if you're like looking on the inside, is there support and stability rather than the title? I think that it could maybe have fewer people get married if we had legal alternatives to marriage and we unbundled it, but it also could provide more stability across more types of relationships where people who wouldn't have gotten married otherwise might then have extra support.
Yeah, that's the point I wanted to make. I wanted to make it clear that I'm not saying that we should do away with marriage for LGBTQ plus people. I'm saying that there need to be alternatives based on the generation, what we're hearing from the generation. Marriage means, you mentioned Justice Kennedy, he actually quoted one of the amicus briefs that Family Equality wrote in his opinion, where he talked about how marriage is good for children, and he quoted us. So marriage means a lot to me as an LGBTQ plus person. As the organization, we not only were in the marriage fight, we helped pass the Respect for Marriage Act in 2022 after Dobbs was overturned. Really, it is about alternatives, and it really is about thinking about what is the next sort of evolution as it relates to marriage, because there's not just a one size fits all.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, and it's about drilling down on why do we want people to get married? Exactly. Specifically. If you could only name one reason that would be great for society, what is the one reason you want them to get married? Because if people entered into it with that as the bullseye, it could be really powerful. I mean, people could have much stronger relationships. We have time? No, we don't. We sure don't. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thanks. That was great.